The night felt endless, the air thick with the smell of pine and the distant hum of crickets. The three of us, me, Luke, and Sarah, had decided on one last summer adventure before school swallowed us whole again. We weren't doing anything particularly rebellious, just walking down the cracked asphalt roads of our quiet town, sharing a bag of stale chips and laughing a little too loudly. We first noticed the car at the corner of Maple and Fifth, an old, beat-up white sedan, parked under a flickering street lamp. Its engine was off, but the faint glow of a cigarette ember illuminated the driver's window. We didn't think much of it at first. It was late, people parked in weird spots all the time. But as we passed by, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us, following our every step. We kept walking, but the laughter had died down. Luke glanced over his shoulder, his face pale in the dim glow of the streetlights. "It's still there," he muttered under his breath. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the car creeping forward, its headlights off, rolling almost silently along the cracked asphalt. The cigarette ember was gone now, leaving the inside of the car cloaked in darkness. Sarah's hand found mine, her grip trembling. "Guys, let's cut through the woods," she whispered. The woods ran parallel to the street, thick with overgrown branches and underbrush. It wasn't the best idea. Getting lost in there would be easy, but staying on the road felt worse. Without another word, we slipped off the pavement and into the shadows beneath the trees. Branches snapped under our shoes as we pushed deeper into the woods. I glanced back and froze. The car had stopped, parked haphazardly at the edge of the trees, its doors wide open. Two figures stepped out, silhouetted against the faint orange glow of the streetlight. They were both men, their shapes bulky and uneven, as if they were wearing heavy jackets. One held something long and metallic in his hand, a crowbar, glinting faintly in the moonlight. The other carried a flashlight, its beam sweeping lazily across the edge of the forest. "Keep your voices down," Luke hissed. "Don't step on anything loud." We crouched low and moved deeper into the trees, every noise amplified in the suffocating silence. From behind us, a voice called out, rough, irritated, "Spread out. We don't have much time. We need to find them now." My stomach clenched, and Sarah let out a faint, broken sound, barely more than a breath. The flashlight beam cut through the trees, scanning left and right, growing closer with every pass. We ducked behind a thick tree trunk, our backs pressed against the rough bark. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Luke pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with terror. The men were getting closer. The flashlight beam swept across the forest floor, cutting through the tangled underbrush and briefly illuminating Sarah's sneakers before sliding away. I could hear the men's footsteps, heavy, deliberate, boots crunching against twigs and dead leaves. They weren't rushing. They were hunting. "Did you hear that?" one of them muttered, his voice low and gravelly. The second man, the one with the crowbar, grunted. "They're in here. I know they are. Keep your light steady." I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, her shallow breaths tickling my ear as we huddled behind the thick tree trunk. Luke was a few feet away, pressed low to the ground behind a rotting log, his face slick with sweat. None of us dared to move. The flashlight beam suddenly froze, aimed just inches from where Luke was hiding. My chest tightened as the man with the light took a slow step forward, shining the beam directly at the log. "Come on out now," the man said softly, his voice dripping with something wrong. "We won't hurt you. We just need to have a little conversation." Luke's eyes met mine through the shadows. He was trying so hard not to breathe, not to make a sound. But then Sarah shifted slightly, just a fraction of an inch, and a twig snapped under her shoe. The flashlight whipped in our direction. There, the man with the light barked, "Run!" Luke yelled, exploding from behind the log. We broke cover, adrenaline surging through my veins as I grabbed Sarah's arm and sprinted deeper into the woods. The flashlight beam jerked wildly as the men gave chase, their shouts cutting through the night air. Branches whipped against my face, sharp and cold. My lungs burned as we stumbled over roots and uneven ground, but we couldn't stop. Behind us, I could hear the metallic clang of the crowbar hitting something. A tree trunk? Maybe. And the men's voices growing louder. "Split up," Luke shouted. "They can't follow all of us." But splitting up in the dark felt like a death sentence. Sarah was still clutching my arm, her breath coming in sharp gasps, and I wasn't about to let go of her. Ahead, I spotted a cluster of rocks partially hidden by thick ferns. "There," I whispered, dragging Sarah toward them. We ducked down, squeezing ourselves into the narrow space between the rocks, pulling ferns over us as best we could. The footsteps grew louder again, stomping through the underbrush, accompanied by harsh, frustrated voices. "They're still here somewhere," one of the men shouted. "Spread out. They can't have gone far." We stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled closer and closer. The footsteps were close now, too close. Through a gap in the ferns, I could see the faint glow of the flashlight beam sweeping across the forest floor, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Sarah's grip on my arm was so tight it felt like her nails might pierce my skin. Neither of us dared to breathe. "They're around here. I know they're around here," one of the men growled, his voice tight with frustration. The beam of light paused, hovering over the rocks where we were hidden. My chest ached from holding my breath, my heart hammering so hard I thought they might hear it. For a long, terrible moment, the man stood still. His boots were just feet from us, the flashlight beam resting just inches away from our hiding spot. I could hear him breathing, slow, heavy, deliberate. Then, somewhere deeper in the woods, Luke shouted, "Hey, over here!" The flashlight snapped away, and the man spun on his heel. "There's one," he bellowed. Sarah let out a shaky exhale as the men barreled through the underbrush toward Luke's voice, their shouts growing fainter with distance. I grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the tight crevice between the rocks. "We have to go now," I whispered. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, crouched low, weaving through the underbrush. My knees felt weak, my hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop. Luke had bought us time, but it wouldn't last. Ahead, I spotted faint light filtering through the trees, the glow of distant streetlights. We were close to the edge of the woods, close to safety. But then, from somewhere behind us, a scream tore through the night. Luke's voice. Sarah froze, her wide eyes locking onto mine. "We have to go back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No," I said, shaking my head, my voice trembling. "We can't. He's..." Another voice cut through the darkness, sharp and cruel. "Gotcha." We didn't wait. We ran. Branches clawed at my face, thorns scraped against my arms. But I didn't stop. The forest thinned, the streetlights growing brighter, and finally, we burst out onto the pavement of a suburban street. Sarah collapsed onto her knees, gasping for breath. I spun around, expecting to see the two men charging after us, but the forest behind us was still, quiet. A distant siren wailed somewhere far off, and for the first time that night, I let myself believe we might have made it out. We stumbled down the empty street, Sarah still clutching my hand like a lifeline. Her breaths were sharp and uneven, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant noise like a footstep behind us. "What about Luke?" she choked out between gasps. I couldn't answer. I couldn't lie to her, couldn't tell her that he was okay when I'd heard his scream echo through the trees. My mind was racing, replaying the sound over and over. We reached a gas station at the edge of town, its fluorescent lights humming softly in the stillness of the night. The attendant, a tired-looking guy with thick glasses, looked up as we burst through the glass doors. "Help us," Sarah managed to say, her voice trembling. "Please call the police. There are men in the woods. They have our friend." The attendant's face paled, and he fumbled for the phone behind the counter. As he spoke to the dispatcher, Sarah and I slumped into two plastic chairs near the snack aisle. The cold air of the gas station felt sterile and harsh, a stark contrast to the suffocating woods. When the police arrived, two officers stepped out of their patrol car, their radios crackling with faint static. They took our statements, asked us to describe the men, the car, everything. I told them about the crowbars, the flashlight, the smell of cigarette smoke lingering around the white sedan. "We'll send a unit to search the area immediately," one officer said, jotting something into his notepad. "You two need to stay here for now." Sarah nodded weakly, clutching a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee with trembling hands. Hours passed. The sky began to lighten with the soft grays of dawn. A different officer returned to the gas station, his face etched with something heavy and unsaid. "Did you find him?" Sarah asked softly. The officer sighed, removing his cap. "We searched the area extensively. We found signs of a struggle, some disturbed ground, but no sign of your friend. We'll continue looking." The words hit me like a gut punch. Luke was gone. Just gone. The officer placed a hand on my shoulder. "You two were lucky. Whoever those men were, they weren't out there for a casual stroll. You did the right thing by running." A week later, the story made it to the local news. A white sedan was found abandoned in a ditch a few towns over. Inside were blood-stained crowbars, rope, and a tarp. The police said they had leads, but nothing ever came of it. Sarah moved away at the end of the summer. We talked less and less over time, the weight of that night driving a wedge between us. As for me, I still think about Luke. I think about his shout echoing through the trees and the look in his eyes when he told us to run. Sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night, I'll hear faint footsteps behind me. A rhythm too deliberate, too heavy to be random. I'll see an old white sedan parked on an empty street corner, its engine off, its windows dark, and every time I walk faster, reminding myself that I made it out, but Luke didn't. The night was warm, the air thick with the smell of distant rain and summer flowers. My cousin Lucas and I had been planning this all week, sneaking out after midnight, slipping past our sleeping parents, and making our way to the canal on the edge of town. It wasn't about the canal itself. It was the thrill of being out when we weren't supposed to be, the kind of rebellious adventure kids our age lived for. The streets were mostly empty, the glow of streetlights casting pale yellow circles onto the cracked pavement. Lucas was a step ahead, his hoodie pulled up, hands stuffed into his pockets. "Come on, slowpoke," he whispered, glancing back with a grin. I rolled my eyes and picked up my pace, but as we rounded a corner onto Willow Street, we both stopped dead in our tracks. Under one of the flickering streetlights stood a man. The man stood perfectly still, his silhouette framed by the flickering light above him. He was tall, thin, dressed in a long coat that hung limply around his frame. His head was tilted slightly downward, as if he were staring at something on the cracked pavement below, but I could feel it. Even with his face obscured by shadows, I knew he was looking at us. Who is that?" I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the hum of the distant power lines. Lucas didn't answer. His grin had vanished, replaced by a tight line across his face. "Let's just go another way." We crossed the street without taking our eyes off the man. He didn't move, not at first, but just as we turned the corner, I glanced back and saw him take a step forward. Slow, deliberate, his shoes scraping against the pavement as he moved into the next circle of flickering light. We picked up our pace, practically jogging now as we headed toward the canal. My heart pounded in my chest, and my stomach felt tight. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Coincidence. Maybe just some guy out for a late-night walk. But then we saw him again. At the next intersection, under another flickering streetlight, there he was. The same still posture, the same slight tilt of his head. No way he got here before us," Lucas said, his voice trembling slightly. It didn't make sense. We had taken turns, cut across uneven sidewalks, moved fast. But somehow, impossibly, he was already there. Lucas grabbed my wrist. "We're going back home. Now." We turned around and started running. Our shoes pounded against the pavement, our breath sharp and ragged. The empty streets felt endless, the silence oppressive. But as we rounded another corner, my stomach dropped. There he was again, another flickering streetlight, another still figure staring. We skidded to a stop, our breaths sharp and ragged. The man stood under the flickering light, perfectly still, perfectly silent. His head tilted ever so slightly to one side, like he was studying us, waiting. "This isn't possible," Lucas said, his voice cracking. We turned around. We went the other way. The air felt heavier now, thick and suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man took a step forward. The scraping sound of his shoe against the asphalt cut through the silence like a knife. "Go!" Lucas hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. We bolted down a side alley, our feet pounding against uneven cobblestones, broken glass crunching underfoot. The shadows felt alive here, twisting and reaching for us with every flicker of a nearby light. At the end of the alley, we emerged onto another empty street. It was quieter here, the sound of distant crickets chirping mixed with the faint hum of streetlights. But as we slowed down, trying to catch our breath, Lucas grabbed my arm and pointed. At the far end of the street, standing under another flickering street lamp, was the man. No, this isn't happening," I whispered, clutching my chest. Lucas was shaking his head, his face pale under the weak glow of the distant light. He's playing with us. He's hurting us." The man took another step forward, his long coat swaying slightly in the breeze. "Back into the woods," Lucas said suddenly, nodding toward a narrow path between two houses. It was overgrown, nearly hidden by tall grass and brambles. "We can lose him in there." We dove into the path, branches whipping at our faces and leaves crunching underfoot. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by thin streaks of moonlight filtering through the trees. But then, somewhere behind us, we heard it. The faint scrape of a shoe against gravel. He was following us. The sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps followed us into the woods, growing fainter and louder in an unsettling rhythm, like he was always just far enough behind to keep us guessing. The path twisted and narrowed, the branches overhead forming a tangled ceiling that blocked out most of the moonlight. Lucas led the way, his hoodie snagging on low-hanging branches as we stumbled over roots and uneven ground. My breath was sharp and ragged, my throat dry. Every crunch of leaves underfoot felt impossibly loud. "Do you hear him?" I whispered, clutching Lucas's sleeve. He stopped for a moment, holding up his hand. Silence. Just the faint chirp of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the briefest moment, I let myself believe we'd lost him. And then we heard it. A faint scrape from somewhere in the dark behind us. Closer this time. Lucas swore under his breath and started moving again, pulling me along as the narrow path opened into a small clearing. The ground here was damp and uneven, scattered with rocks and old, rotting logs. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Lucas scanned the clearing, his eyes darting to a large hollow tree stump on the far side. "There. We'll hide. Stay quiet." We squeezed into the hollow stump, our backs pressed against the damp, moss-covered wood. The space was tight, claustrophobic, and the smell of decay filled my nose. Lucas put a finger to his lips, his wide eyes locked on mine. The forest fell silent again. Then, from somewhere just beyond the clearing, we heard him. The man stepped into the faint moonlight, his coat hanging loose around his thin frame. His head turned slowly, scanning the area. The faint glimmer of something sharp, metal, maybe, caught the moonlight as his hand moved slightly beneath his coat. He stepped forward, the weight of each footfall pressing into the soft earth. His head tilted upward slightly, as if he were sniffing the air. I pressed my hand over my mouth, biting down on my knuckles to keep from making a sound. Lucas's chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. For a moment, the man stood perfectly still, his head turning ever so slightly in our direction. His face remained in shadow, obscured by the brim of his hat. And then, just as slowly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness of the trees, disappearing into the night. We stayed in that hollow stump for what felt like hours. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved. Eventually, the first faint hints of dawn began to filter through the leaves, casting the woods in pale shades of gray and gold. "Do you think he's gone?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. Lucas nodded slowly, his face pale and hollow-eyed. "We need to go. Now." We crept out of the stump and back onto the narrow path, every step cautious, every shadow suspicious. The forest felt different in the early light, less menacing, but still thick with an unnatural silence. When we finally emerged back onto the empty suburban streets, the sky was streaked with soft oranges and pinks. Our house was only a few blocks away, and we ran the rest of the way without looking back. We never spoke about that night, not really. Every time I tried to bring it up, Lucas would just shake his head and change the subject. But sometimes, when we walked home after dark, we'd both flinch at the sight of a flickering streetlight. And every now and then, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder when walking alone at night, half expecting to see him, standing perfectly still, head slightly tilted, always watching. The abandoned St. Augustine Hospital had been closed for over 20 years, yet it still stood on the edge of town like a crumbling monument to something people preferred to forget. Broken windows stared out like hollow eyes, and rusted chains dangled from the padlocked front gates. Everyone at school had heard the stories, whispers of shadows moving in the halls, of distant footsteps echoing in the empty operating rooms. But for Nate and me, the legends weren't enough. We had to see it for ourselves. We slipped in through a broken side window, our sneakers crunching softly on shattered glass. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew, and every breath felt like inhaling decay. Nate held up his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and revealing peeling wallpaper, overturned gurneys, and scattered medical files strewn across the floor. "Man, this place is straight out of a horror movie," he muttered. I nodded, swallowing hard as we moved deeper into the hospital's bowels. The deeper we went, the colder the air became. Our footsteps echoed faintly down long, empty hallways, and every creak of the building felt like a whisper. Nate's flashlight flickered occasionally, casting shaky beams across faded signs. Radiology, morgue, operating theater. "Let's not go near the morgue," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked slightly. Nate smirked. "You scared already?" Before I could respond, we heard it. A faint tapping sound, so soft we almost missed it. Tap, tap, tap. It came from somewhere down the hallway to our left, near a pair of heavy double doors marked intensive care unit. We froze. "Did you hear that?" Nate whispered. "Yeah," I said, barely breathing. "It's probably just something falling. Pipes? Maybe." But the taps came again. Tap, tap, tap. Steady. Rhythmic. Too deliberate to be random noise. Nate aimed his flashlight toward the sound. The ICU doors were slightly ajar, and a faint sliver of darkness stretched between them. Without speaking, we crept closer, our shoes scuffing against the tile floor. The tapping stopped. We stood just feet from the doors now, the stale smell of old antiseptic and mildew thick in the air. Nate pushed the door slightly, and it creaked on rusted hinges, revealing a dark corridor lined with hospital rooms on either side. But it wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from a room to the right. Room 208. The door was boarded up with uneven planks of wood nailed haphazardly across the frame. Through a narrow gap between two boards, we could just barely see inside. There was someone standing there. A figure, cloaked in shadows, stood perfectly still in the middle of the room. The beam from Nate's flashlight barely reached them, but I could make out faint details. A thin frame, long hair hanging limply over a pale face, shoulders hunched slightly forward. "Hello," Nate said, his voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't move. "Nate," I whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Let's go. Now." But as we turned away from the door, the tapping started again. Louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't soft anymore. It wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate, purposeful, and it was coming from inside room 208. We froze in place, every hair on my body standing on end. The knocking, knock, 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 continued, slow and deliberate, each hit echoing down the empty hallway. Nate's flashlight shook in his hand, its beam dancing across the dusty floor as he turned back toward the boarded-up door. Who's in there?" Nate stammered, his voice barely louder than a whisper. No response. The figure behind the boards remained perfectly still, their head tilted slightly downward, their face obscured by shadow and strands of limp hair. But then something changed, the faintest shift in posture, a small tilt of the head, like they were listening to us. The knocking stopped. A silence settled over us, thick, suffocating, waiting. "Nate," I whispered, clutching his arm. "We need to leave. Right now." But Nate didn't move. His flashlight was still aimed at the gap between the boards, his face pale and his mouth slightly open. And then we heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." It was a voice, thin, hollow, and cracked, like it was coming from someone who hadn't spoken in years. It didn't sound natural. It sounded wrong. Nate took a step closer to the door. "Who are you?" "Stop," I hissed, yanking him back. Don't talk to it." But then, slowly, the figure in room 208 began to move. Their shoulders twitched, and their head rose slightly, revealing the faint glint of their eyes catching the light from Nate's flashlight. They were wide open, glassy and unblinking, staring directly at us. The knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. But this time it wasn't on the door, it was lower. It was coming from the floor. Something heavy and sharp slammed into the wood beneath our feet, and we both stumbled backward, our shoes scraping against the dirty tiles. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Nate's sleeve and pulling him away from the door. We bolted down the dark hallway, the beam from Nate's flashlight jerking wildly as he ran. Behind us, the knocking turned into frantic, rapid pounding bang, 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 followed by the sound of wood splintering and something heavy dragging across the floor. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see whatever was behind that door. We burst through the double ICU doors, our feet skidding across the dusty linoleum as we rounded the corner back toward the broken window we'd used to enter the hospital. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop running. The faint sound of dragging, scrape, 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 echoed from somewhere deep in the hospital behind us. We scrambled through the broken window, shards of glass slicing into my hands as I pulled myself out. Nate followed, landing hard on the gravel outside. We didn't stop running until we were blocks away from the hospital, bent over, gasping for breath under the orange glow of a flickering streetlight. Neither of us spoke on the walk home. The silence felt heavy, filled with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. The next morning, Nate texted me, "Don't tell anyone what happened. Just don't go back there." I agreed, but every now and then, when I'm lying in bed at night, I'll hear it. Faint, almost like it's coming from somewhere far away. A slow, deliberate knock, 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 and I'll wonder if whatever was in room 208 ever stopped looking for us.